I kind of lost some things. Make sure.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that's my first screen. A few slides here and talk about diversity and some different aspects of that. Because usually when we talk about diversity, most of the time people think in just terms of race and ethnicity. Oh, it's still there? Okay.
Yep, it's
Most of the
still
time
here.
people think of race and ethnicity, but diversity is everything about us. All our different identities, race, religion, sexual orientation, genders, all these things that make up who we are. Even some of our hobbies and things that we like to get involved with becomes part of our identity. And we don't tend to think those as culture, multicultural. We think of clubs and organizations, but everything you become a part of, every group is its own unique little culture group. And this is a definition that I like to use about culture. It's a learned and shared values and beliefs of a group and behaviors of a group of interacting people. And we have a lot of cultures, and of course, most of the time people think of race and ethnicity, but you've got gender differences, gender cultures, um, religious cultures, but you also have artists, musicians, gamers, Greeks, all these different things that make up your identity. And you put a group of people together, and it becomes a small group, and it's really it's a culture, it's an identity. And all of these make up who we are, makes up that uniqueness of ourselves and how it shapes how we see the world and how we identify and how we interact with each other. So let's talk about cultural competency, which is a term that's being thrown around a lot. Globalism, multiculturalism, intercultural. It gets kind of confusing, but I want to use this term cultural competency and using this model of intercultural sensitivity, because we're talking about how we can, all these cultures can get along and interact and be comfortable with each other on our campus. Now, this model was developed a long time ago, but we all go through these stages of intercultural sensitivity. You may not realize it that you do this, but we all do this, even from the time we're young. If you think about when you were a kid and you were growing up, when you realize that not every, you kind of think that the whole world revolves around your little house, your little home, your little family. And it's not till you go visit somebody else and you realize that they do something different, like, oh, they don't live the same way we do. Or you go farther away, or you get to a point where maybe you travel out of state or even out of the country, and you start to realize that there's a whole bigger world, people live things in a different way. And now, a lot of times we go through this in a sense of race and ethnicity, but we look at different religions, sexual orientations, gender identities, all these different things, or all these cultural groups that we go through this process, and sometimes quicker and sometimes shorter, sometimes faster. But we all do this. But these are the stages, and we're not going to spend a lot. We can really go into in depth in all these, but just kind of highlight there's a process and that we're all at different places in understanding this. But the first level, the first section here always is defined as ethnocentric, where we see the world depending on the standards of our own cultural identity. And the first stage is denial, which personally I don't think that's maybe the best ideal, but it's denial where there's only one, that you just see the world from your own center of your own reality, where you maybe not had a lot of exposure to other cultures, other areas, other differences. And then you go to the defense where you do get exposed, and there's kind of a defense mechanism that kicks in. But usually in that phase, you're just relying on stereotypes of other groups. Minimization is the next stage, where you recognize other cultural groups, but you see them still based on your own cultural values and beliefs, assuming that they all share a universal value system across the board. And I'm going to come back to these terms colorblind and us and them. The next stage is ethno-relative stage, where you recognize cultures and recognize there's differences, and then there's an acceptance of those, acceptance of different worldviews. And then you go to the adaptation phase, where you start to really see and understand these differences. And then get into the integration phase, where you can go in and move out of different cultural groups effortlessly, easily, without creating challenges or problems. And that's the area that I like to call cultural competency, because it's a skill. It's a skill to go in and out of these different groups, depending on whether it's a religious group, gender groups, or sexual identities, all the different groups that we have on our campus, to just go in and out and move effectively in and out of those groups. Now, sometimes, depending on where you're at, you could be in a minimization phase for one cultural identity, but be in an integration phase for maybe another identity. So you may not be at the same place for some time, for some groups. And I'll use, say, like, for example, you see this in a lot of politics where you could be over in this phase, maybe you're a hardcore Republican or Democrat, and you may be over here, but on another scale of gender, you may be over here. Um, but I want to kind of point out a couple things that we use, the term of us and them, because you see that a lot in politics and in the way politics are done. It's kind of a strategy they use. That us and them mentality, it can be good for building teams. It can be good for, if you're on a sports team, you're pulling people together, you're on a rally, your organization or groups. It's a good strategy, but it's kind of doesn't work well when you're talking about cultural competency. Minimization phase, we hear this term colorblind when people are in that phase. And I just want to point out that term. Usually when people are in that phase, they see that as a very positive thing. Using the term colorblind, you hear that a lot. But one of the challenges with that is that for people who identify by a particular color, such as African Americans or myself or Hispanic, that color brown has a lot more to it than just a color. So usually when people hear that term, like for myself, here's the term colorblind, I understand it more. But when people don't understand, is that when you say that, for somebody whose identity is attached to that color and the culture and everything behind that, the message that comes across is that you don't see them, you don't see their culture, you don't see everything about that community. It's taken as a negative comment when people hear that their identity is closely tied to a color for who they are. So even for myself, an example where I hear that was that, well, you don't see my family, you don't see my community, the foods, the culture, everything's connected to that cultural identity. So when these people say those things, it can be taken as very negatively. So the goal is to move people along these lines, to move them to that direction, because we're not all at the same place in our understanding of culture and where we're at in our lives. And it's a journey, it's a process, things that we are experiencing, and we change as we get older and go through different things. So this is the definition of cultural competency. And this is the ability to understand, communicate, and effectively interact with people across cultures, whether that's religion, sexual identities, even hobbies. You got gamers, you got athletes, you got musicians, all these groups to be able to interact effectively across cultural groups. But there are some challenges to this. That we're not all the same place in our understanding of diversity, but we need to get to a level of comfortability on diversity, which is a real challenge if you, of course, watch the news and social media. There's a lot of uncomfortableness going on. We need to develop a trust and respect, an environment for that, and a space for honest, open discussion and dialogues. We need to allow personal history, feelings, and emotions. That's one thing that we tend not to do, is we tend to shy away from or have a challenge is understanding people's emotions and feelings when we have these conversations. So we need to approach diversity with empathy and compassion, especially for people's emotions and feelings and their own identities. So along those lines, as I mentioned, that we don't share the same definitions and understanding of a lot of these isms: racism, sexism, ableism, misogynism. A lot of things can affect the way we perceive that and what it means to us. And I'll give you an example with racism. The generation of college students right now see generation in a different way than, for example, the generation before, or even for myself being of an older generation. What I experienced as racism back in the 70s is different than what we're seeing today. In the same way, it's different for like my parents. My parents experienced racism in the 60s is different than what we're seeing today. And my grandparents experienced different from what I experienced. So every generation, it's a different experience and what that means and what that looks like. And so that's why it makes it challenging to talk to different generations and even talking to your parents. And trying to understand and having these conversations on any of these different isms or dynamics or what we're experiencing, because we all have a different perspective on what that looks like and what that definition is. And so we're not on the same page. One thing about cultural competency and what it encompasses, an awareness of one's own worldview, your own world, your own worldview, who you are, how you identify, how you see the world, having that awareness of yourself, and knowledge of cultural practices of other worldviews and the skills for communication interactions across cultures. It's a skill. You can develop it and get better at it. A positive attitude and curiosity to cultural differences, allowing space for cultural views and perspectives that are different, and allowing everyone the dignity of maintaining their own identity. We're going to come back to that. That's going to be we'll talk more about these cultural groups and allowing each other to have their own cultural values and belief systems on our campus. What it doesn't mean is that you have to agree or disagree on cultural differences or what another culture, the way they view the world, accepting or not accepting, or taking a position or a side, taking on the values or beliefs of another culture. It doesn't mean that. That's a next level type of thing if you want to move into another culture and take on those values and beliefs. Now we're going to talk about belonging. Excuse my cough here. Fitting in versus belonging. In student affairs, we have this slogan called "You belong here," and you hear that a lot. And you're hearing a lot about belonging, and not just on our campus, but in all these different conversations. And corporations and companies are using this term a lot to talk about how do we create a community of belonging for everybody on our campuses, in our institutions, or organizations that you have. So let's look at what that means, because we talk about that, but a lot of times we don't know what exactly does that mean. So I like this definition from Brene Brown. She talks a lot about this belonging concept, and she compares it to the difference of fitting in versus belonging. Fitting in is assessing and acclimating your environment and adjusting and adapting to that environment. What do you say? How do you act? How do you dress? What do you look like? What do you not do? What do you to try to fit in? Belonging is being yourself first, speaking your own truth, telling your own story, not betraying yourself or other people. And it doesn't require you to change who you are. And think about the places where you really feel like you belong, that you feel that sense of belonging and what that entails. And think of that versus fitting in. And one of the challenges behind this, with the definition, opposite of belonging is fitting in. Belonging is being who you are. Now, it sounds really good, and it is a good goal to have. But some of the challenges behind this is that we're always finding that balance between fitting in and belonging. As y'all came to UT Dallas and became part of university, you wanted to learn the customs, and that's what orientation teaches you, what the culture is on campus. And we adjust and we adapt, and we make changes. Companies, you adjust, you adapt to different environments. But the challenge is not to find that balance between fitting or belonging and maintaining your own cultural identity, your own true self. It's always kind of a back and forth in the process to navigate. So thinking about that in terms of all these cultural groups that we have on campus, all these different identities, because sometimes we want everyone to feel like they belong and be recognized. But there are some things when you think about cultural groups and organizations, that there's some groups that are inherently going to be in conflict with another just because of the values and beliefs that they hold. I'll give you some examples. Let's look at religion. Say you have say you're in the Galaxy rooms, and in one room there's an LGBT group meeting, and the next room right next door is a Catholic organization meeting. And each group has its own unique identity and values and beliefs. And one of the challenges, if somebody from an LGBT community wants to visit or go into the Catholic club meeting, well, it can be a challenge, because I don't know if you're following with Catholic organization. I'm just using that example where recently the Pope issued a statement about not blessing the same-sex marriages and not being able to recognize those. And it can be very challenging for somebody to be in that room and not feel welcome or feel comfortable if they want to visit that, just by the nature of the values and beliefs of that organization. There's some other groups that you can find the same dynamic taking place. Maybe we've got a Democratic club and a Republican club. You've got gender-based clubs. you've got religious-based clubs, you've got race-based clubs, and they all have their own unique identities and values that may come in conflict with other groups. And also, but you may visit one of these clubs and not feel welcome or not feel like a belonging. So I pose that question too with these clubs. What happens? What do you do when that happens? When you've got someone who doesn't feel comfortable, where's the responsibility? Should the club adapt and adjust? Or how do we navigate that so someone can feel comfortable? Or recognizing that someone may not be the club for you just for that moment in time, but it may not because of a discriminating, kind of we don't like you, but just the values just don't mesh sometimes. How do we manage that? And how do we allow for those differences on our campus so you can still be who you are and you can still not feel that and feel like you belong or not, or, I think you get what I'm saying. So what we're going to do, I just want to show the slides and bring up those concepts. We're going to go back to a conversation mode. And I'm going to stop sharing and ask Katie to join me. That's what that's about. Check. Hey, Katie. Yeah. Thanks for joining me with this. And I have a question. I know you already introduced yourself, but I guess my question for you, since you represent or work with a lot of international student organizations, and we all talking, we talk about becoming part of the campus and feeling welcome and belonging. So what does your office do to help students from other countries transition and be a part and feel like they belong on campus?
Well, we help our international students with transition to the university. So that's a big part of our mission. A big part is international student orientation. And we have our international student support series of events where we host events specifically targeting international students to kind of support them in understanding American culture and supporting I call them cultural student organizations, but with your description of culture, we could really open that up to anything. But those are organizations that target mostly international students, like the Indian Student Association or the Friendship Association of Chinese Students and Scholars, those student organizations that really support our international students. So we support those student organizations specifically who helps international students once they arrive here in the United States with getting picked up at the airport, maybe finding accommodations once they get here, finding rentals, getting credit cards, banking, cell phones, all those types of things. So we support those student organizations by either advising them or just helping them with funding for events, things like that, and then helping them with communications to students of particular demographics. So I can open that up to you guys too. If you're looking to communicate with students from a particular region of the world, we can always send out communications with that as well. So if we're looking to target students from a particular area.
Cool. So I just thought of this question because when I do presentations on culture and students coming to our campus and being a part of this, culture shock, that topic comes up for me. And not just, and what I found when we talk about culture and transitioning cultures, normally we think of culture shock with international students coming here. But I've talked to students from Oak Cliff that come here, or the border towns that come here, or from out of state that come to UT Dallas can be a culture shock. Yeah. If they're not used to the diversity that we have here. Do you see that, or you see students come to you and say, because it's hard to recognize, especially if you don't realize what's happening with culture shock.
I think I don't get a lot of non-international students who come to me asking about culture shock. I think if they do, maybe I don't know that they're not international students. We address culture shock during our international student orientation, and all students are invited to any event that we host. So if we are hosting an event that might be targeted towards international students, if there's students who aren't international students who want to attend, and it's one of our kind of transitional events, then I don't know if they're not international students because we open it up to everybody on campus. That's perfectly fine. We've hosted events that are just simply maybe pizza nights and chat nights to help students get to know each other and understand the campus tours. We used to do an 883 bus tour just to show students the apartments along the 883 route and take them out for ice cream. Simple things like that, just to show students kind of the neighborhood and how to navigate public transportation. Something as simple as that, because I mean, I never rode public transportation as a kid. I didn't learn about that until I moved to Texas. I come from, the suburbs. I drove everywhere. So if you don't, just like you're saying with, learning diversity, that was a big shock for me when I moved here. So I do think that is a very big culture shock for a lot of people, is coming to a big city from maybe a small town, even if you're not coming from another country, or coming to Texas from another state. I moved here from Ohio, and moving to Texas was a huge wake-up call for me. I always joke with people that I had felt like I was learning a new language when I came to Texas. And not just because a lot of people are Spanish speakers, and I had to learn a little bit of that, but, integrating the word y'all into my language and learning some of those phrases like fixin' to, and some of those little, just common phrases that people use was a big shock. And it's a very different culture in Texas than it was where I grew up in Ohio.
Yeah, I see that too. We don't think of that as culture shock sometimes. Even students who come here from small towns, or even white students who come here, and this is not, we have what I want to say, our white student population that identify that is getting, the percentage is going down and down, but it can be a transition and a challenge for some people to adjust to this campus. So I want to bring up the next topic, and we'll open it up to some audience questions too. If you have questions or comments, we'd like to hear from you, your perspective, and or even questions you may have for us. Is how do you deal with when your values conflict with another group's values, or beliefs or systems? Because I know when I go to, as an example, we try to get along with everybody, especially the work that we do. We're so interacting with all these cultures and really on a personal level. And I know going to like the Passport to the World, where they have all this great food out there. And, it's almost like that same phase as culture, where you go the first time, you're like, oh, this is awesome. We got all this free food, going to eat everything and all this stuff. But after I did it a few times, like, there's some foods that just didn't settle right with me. Well, there's some foods I start to learn, like, I know we have a very large Indian population, and they're very, very giving with a lot of their culture and their foods. But there's some foods where I like, I can't eat that. It's just not something that it's just difficult, or don't enjoy. It's like, I really don't like this. But the challenge I have when I'm around those groups is how to do that and say, thank you, but I can't eat that, and not be offended. Because with some cultures, like Indian cultures, it's a big part of their culture and identity is their food, and they want to share that with you. It's almost like, no, thank you for the gift you're giving me. Have you ever had those? Because you deal with all these different groups. How do you manage that? How do you deal with those kind of challenges when it conflicts with your own, maybe a value, maybe a religious belief, or something like that too?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky situation to navigate. I think the food thing that you're bringing up is a hard one, because I'm the same way. There's certain foods that I can't eat. I have some food allergies, and I think it's okay to say that. I think it's okay to, maybe you can accept it and let them know, oh, thank you, that's so kind. Can you let me know what's in it? And maybe you can ask them and be curious about it and let them know, I have an allergy to this. Maybe if it's something that you're not actually allergic to, but just disrupts your stomach, that's a food allergy. That's something that's upset with you. And you can explain that it might make you sick. They don't want to make you sick. So that's okay for them. But if you show that curiosity and that interest, I think that's being very gracious, and that's okay to accept that, and that's being kind and excited about their culture and their food. I've also experienced that with religion. A student wanted to show me how to say a prayer, a Muslim prayer. I am very particular about religion. I consider myself an atheist, and it's not something that I care for. And I decided at that time, though, that I would allow him to show it to me and to let him teach it to me because it was something important to him. And so he wanted to teach it to me. So I think there's sometimes when I have to set aside my personal beliefs or personal value, and that was my choice, to let him teach me something and to learn something new. And that didn't mean that I changed my belief or changed my personal value. It was hard for me to do that, though, because that was something that I felt I stood for. But I also know that it was very important for him to share that with me. So it was a very different experience for me. But in the end, it was a nice experience, and I'm glad that I allowed him to do that for me and to share this very spiritual thing with me. But I guess, do other people have similar experiences? Have you also had times when there's been a conflict?
Yeah, I'd like to hear that from some of our students, or even, I want to also bring another topic too to discuss is, some of our groups, or a lot of groups, are very based on maybe like a gender club. Like we've got clubs for women that identity, like there's the Society of Women Engineers, or some of the Greeks are sororities, or predominantly females, or some groups are predominantly male. And I know within our the rules or guidelines is that you can't really discriminate. Anybody can join any club, but some clubs are specific for a specific purpose, to empower women, to empower LGBT, or to empower different things. And by doing that, it seems like that can be discriminating to people who are not that way. Or how do there's that challenge to going on when people want to come visit your club and not offending things, and how to navigate those kind of differences. Did we have a question? I saw somebody was typing something in the chat, but then it went away, or it went away on my screen. But if any students have a question or comment, you can unmute your mic and just jump in. We'd love to hear from you and your thoughts or questions about, because we get that a lot in our office, maybe yours. We're getting a lot more requests on how to make your organization more inclusive for diversity, which can be a challenge with all the different beliefs and values that people hold. And how do we do that? And how do we accommodate people? And how do we deal with people who may not like our club for some reason, or don't feel comfortable and want to speak out about it? Moment of silence as people sit uncomfortably. Cool. So usually when people don't have questions, it's kind of like, man, we must have done a great job. We covered everything. But I know sometimes this may be new information, and you need to think about it and stuff. But it's one of those challenges that we, wanted to bring up and discuss and talk about how to make your club more inclusive and welcoming. But being aware of these differences as they come into your group, there may be some challenges that you may not be ready for. Realize that if you have your beliefs in your club and you've got all these things worked out, and then somebody comes in, it's like, oh, this may be good, but it conflicts with another part of their identity, or part of them, who they are at some point. How do we manage that? Cool. So let me bring, if Tanil, I know Tanil's out there, and Tanil works with a lot of student organizations. And let me ask you, Tanil, what are some of the, I guess most common things that you hear from student orgs regarding diversity and some of the challenges?
I can say that it's normally a hot topic with student organizations. I know the first time we hosted this session, we had a student who attended because his organization as a whole really felt like they weren't diverse enough, or they were having some diversity issues. And so that was the sole reason why the student came to the previous session, to learn a little bit more about what they could do better as an organization to address the topic of diversity. But I don't think that it really comes up within the organization. I think a lot of times when students are starting new groups, they have a particular mission or purpose in mind. And again, sometimes that can be a little bit closed off. And we do have to remind some students, like, this organization has to be open to all, regardless of if they believe what you believe or they identify the same way that you identify. And it just makes it, again, more inclusive for students to join a variety of organizations at UT Dallas and to be able to experience a variety of organizations as well. I think, of course, college is all about being able to join and learn new things from people who are unlike yourself. So I think that's kind of the beauty of the organizations that we have and all of the different topics that they cover.
Yeah, thank you. I was familiar with that club, and it made me think about some of the organizations that are not, as we would say, culturally based. Some of the like sport organizations or some of the organizations that are based on the majors. And when I talk to them, they're trying to recognize, well, how does diversity fit within, say, you're a business club? And one of the things that I talk to them about making their club more inclusive is to be aware of the differences of their membership, like religious differences. If somebody, is Muslim and they're part of the club, to make sure when you schedule your meetings that they don't conflict with religious holidays or religious dates or events or programs. We had a club just recently request a presentation for diversity, and it was scheduled on Sunday because they met on Sunday night, and turned out to be Easter Sunday. Well, the club didn't, it wasn't on their mind because they weren't Catholic, or they just didn't think about it, but they just say it's just another Sunday. And I had to bring that up and say, it may not be culturally sensitive to do this on a Sunday, on Easter Sunday. And they kind of like, oh yeah, didn't think about that. To think about those differences of cultures and identities, and whether it's religion, or someone's coming with different, sexual identities, and how you address people, how you talk to your membership, and recognizing those culture differences, because that's where people start to feel like they're not belonging. When you don't recognize those little differences of gender or religion, sexual orientation, race, and things like that.
I think that's honestly true. I would like to know from the students who are attending today, do any of you actually have conversations about diversity? You may not have a committee or a person who's dedicated to it for your organization, but have you all had any sort of diversity conversations? And you can feel free to use the chat, or as Danny mentioned earlier, you can unmute and respond if you'd like to. I see some info coming in the chat here. And if you do have a committee, let us know that you have actually a person in charge of diversity for your organization, or a committee that's in charge of it. It's just interesting to know.
My organization is For Autistic Empowerment, and we're mainly focused on providing like a safe and accepting space for neurodivergent individuals, because that's what we were founded on. But we would also like to educate as many neurotypical people as possible, and we haven't really found a way to really communicate or get involved with neurotypical people. And that's an interesting, it's kind of the opposite of what I suppose this is aiming for.
Well, it's a good conversation to bring up, because in fact it's odd that I was in a session think a couple of days ago, where that topic came up of neurodivergent conversation, which was new. So we're all learning new things. And anything you can bring up to help us learn about these different topics. Because when we think about, one, getting the message out, not just that, but other, we call them disabilities, but challenges that we all have, mental challenges or just social challenges, things that we bring with ourselves, for clubs that don't think about that or recognize, when they have their meetings and the rooms they're using, the presentations they're doing, that they understand that they've got to diversify what they're doing to reach, to accommodate, not say accommodate, it's not even a good word, to be inclusive of everybody in the room. And that's another area that's becoming more known, that's neurodivergency.
Neurodiversity is.
I was going to say, I believe on the Comet calendar, when you are all posting your events, there is, and I think it's automatic, there's a message that talks about accommodations. So Marlena, I think that you're saying that your target audience is for autistic empowerment, but for those groups that are not, used to making accommodations for people who might be looking at neurodiversity or people who might need those accommodations. The Comet calendar specifically has a statement. So if someone's looking at one of your events and says, well, I want to go to that, and it says, please talk to the event organizer about accommodations that you might need. So make sure when you're posting on the Comet calendar, there's contact information for whoever the organizer of your event is. So if it's an email address, a cell phone, to text. That way, like if I have a specific need for when I attend an event, I can email the organizer and just say, hey, I just wanted to see, because I noticed this event had this, would I be able to have this available for me? And, you don't have to, if you're not comfortable saying who you are or, saying a specific disability or anything like that, at least with your event, there is a statement on your event on the Comet calendar, letting people know that you will be able to make accommodations. So just that's there on there.
So what, I think there was a miscommunication because we don't have issues setting up accommodations because all of us are disabled in one form or another. All of us are autistic and or ADHD with any other variety of things. We're trying to get more neurotypical people involved and getting the normies involved and teaching them and showing them that autistic people aren't aliens. So
you want to reach out to a more diverse group of people than just the group that you've been reaching out to.
Yes.
And that's fairly common for a lot of clubs. I hear that from, the Indian Student Association. They want more non-Indians coming to their events. Yeah. We hear that all the time.
Does anybody have any recommendations for Marlena?
But I want to address, Hajar, were you jumping in?
Yes, sorry. Hi. So I'm Hajra Kartia. I work at the Multicultural Center as a diversity peer educator. I just have a thing to say. Could you just share your information and we could spread the word out, through our network, and then us as students, I could even join, I would love to be a part of something different. So why not just share your information and then we'll spread the word out among our people and the groups that I'm familiar with.
All right, cool. Yeah,
I think
totally.
I'm going to share as well about just the educational piece. And I think that is a challenge for all types of organizations, that sometimes it's harder to get a diverse group of people to join because they just don't know. They just don't know, maybe the benefits of joining or how to approach an organization that is different than who they are or what they believe. So I think it's important to share more of the education. Like you said, you want to invite more neurotypical people well, they may say, well, what benefits might I find by joining this organization or participating with you, or how can I even approach you? It may be all in the approach. Sometimes people just don't know how, and they're not comfortable. So I think education is always an important piece when you're trying to share, what makes your organization unique, and what makes it a benefit to join in and or to participate with your group.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was very helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Danny and Katie, I don't want to miss it. We had a couple of things in the chat here. So we did have one group said that at the beginning of the school year, they talked about showing their solidarity for the Black community. Another group said that they don't directly have a diversity or cultural, they're not a diversity or cultural group, but they have workshops in which they have designated people to facilitate discussions around identity, microaggressions, and to touch on some of the things that were talked about today. And then there is another group that's a music organization, and the officers have discussed encouraging diversity by things like playing music by composers of more diverse entities. And so I think that all of these are really great items to kind of help address the diversity within the organizations.
Definitely, and especially like, if you look at the example of the music group, if someone who grows up in the U.S. and they hear music or they study music, even like say if I'm Hispanic or any, but not realizing how much music has not been included in their education, it can be very powerful to the group to recognize that and say, you know what, let's branch out and let's find what we're missing, what we haven't been playing or haven't been doing. And I think any club can do that and look around and say, what are we missing? What are we not bringing to or not presenting or offering in the world of diversity? And that can be any business club, an accounting club. Any club can look at diversity from that own perspective. A sports club, because one of the things that we find too is people tend to think in terms of just racial diversity, and people say, oh, we're very diverse, we're cool, we got it. But there's a lot more diversity to that conversation, even like you mentioned, neurodiversity and disabilities and all the other aspects of that you can expand that into.
Just so y'all know, I put a link in the chat. The Student Affairs Department on campus publishes special dates, which are various holidays, cultural and religious holidays for the next few years. And this is consistently updated. So Danny had mentioned the group wanting Easter Sunday presentation, just not being aware of it. So that was something that struck my mind, because there's been times when organizations have planned events during Ramadan with lots of food, and Ramadan is a very important religious holiday or religious time of fasting. And so there's the dates that are listed there. So you can take a look at those if you want to just be mindful of those when planning events and things like that. That might help with some of your event planning. And if you're outreaching to specific organizations on campus, or you're targeting particular groups for your audience, that might be helpful for you.
Sure. It's just being aware, like I said, learning more, learning all these differences. You mentioned Ramadan, and where they're fasting for the day. If you have members who are part of that and you host a big lunchtime program for your membership, and it turns out that they're fasting, it can be very culturally insensitive, or not considering that aspect of who they are. So any other comments or questions? It's 5:02. I know we want to be respectful of time. We do have an eval that we always like for people to fill out. If you have a moment to fill that out for being a part of this presentation, it does help us in assessing what we do and to make it better for the next time. As we do these presentations and workshops, and just to hear from you. You can express your opinion and thoughts on any topic, and we love to hear from you. So take advantage and fill out our eval for us. So any other thoughts? I didn't see any more questions or comments. So if you want to wrap this up, I'm waiting for a prize. I'm waiting for that raffle. I'm like,
Yes, Allison will be coming
I know,
on.
what do I get?
Yeah, it's a perfect segue into our raffle. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.